Would be 2 or 3 areas where you really think the state should take some interest and put some resources. You want to start with this table first? Morgan's going to be writing up there. Hopefully, some of you can't see the flip chart, but there's not a great place to
Our focus on the state issues was, the primary one was mental health and the issues it raised. Affordable housing, obviously. The caregiving issue, and how we're going to address that in the future. And access to services and access to providers in the future.
Providers and services.
We said information systems, so I think it's access to information. We also said mental health and affordable housing.
So access to information is the new one we're adding right to the list.
A lot of duplicates here, I think.
That's
So
good.
I'll go ahead. Housing, not only affordability, but accessibility and different options for different types of housing. There's a real lack of all of those things. And the access to services, we kind of titled communications. So how do we communicate to providers, consumers, doctors, etc., about what we do in the healthcare industry? How do we market when we don't have a budget? And then consistent messaging, which is always an issue. And then our third area is social isolation. Lack of engagement and community involvement appears to be a pretty big issue in the CASOA. Making sure people have access to meaningful activities, and it is a mental health issue.
Well, we have a lot of repeat already, but our focus here is with healthcare access, specifically around availability of doctors and information and access to benefits. And then the big question of marketing.
What?
Marketing.
Well, we hate to sound repetitive, but I think we've already mentioned housing, and I thought that y'all did a really nice job in identifying the issues around housing, because it's not just low-income housing, it's the whole options. And I was just talking to someone recently who said, I don't need this big house anymore, but if I sell it, there's nothing that I can afford that's smaller. I mean, the smaller houses are more expensive. So it's just that whole issue around housing options. Transit, which is not something new up there, but all the challenges in our rural areas, as well as our metropolitan areas. Caregiving needs, I know it's been showing up on the state survey, but I can speak from Weld that it really has drawn the eyes of many on the caregiving issue. And then last but not least, what we discussed is just information access and what people perceive is how they get the information, how they use the information, when they need it, etc.
What came up in our group, social isolation, connection, which I agree is, is connected to mental health too. We also talked about housing, affordable housing, appropriate, accessible housing, universal design, so information access, which is kind of those three combined, I'd say. Awareness of services, targeting strategies, investing marketing funds in the right places at the right time, and kind of that push-pull between broadcasting versus targeting, I guess.
I'll throw out some different ones. I'll focus on rural aging. I think it was Weld County over there that mentioned it, so good job, Will. So I'll put rural aging on there. Also workforce. We talked a little bit about earlier workforce training, and the like. And then some repeats, general psych, mental health, and housing.
We don't have a whole lot of things that aren't repeats, but I'll just reiterate the marketing and outreach, the education, and the timeliness of that, sort of before the crisis happens, and the availability of medical services. Seems to be something to work out.
I think ours are all up there too. Mostly we talked about access to healthcare. Transportation is a big one we talked about. And of course the housing. Kind of like what Eva said, not just the affordability, but the availability.
So I'll admit that we talked about social isolation, but that was about it. I thought we had a very robust conversation about the actual data and how to interpret that in order to answer these questions. And I thought Todd made a really good point in that given the number of people in the state and how many are anchored to the Front Range, there's sort of an implicit, not bias, but a lean towards the volume in the Front Range, and that it is difficult to determine these focus areas because while it may be important for the state because of the numbers, it could be completely irrelevant, say, in a rural area, to your point, or in the mountain areas, or on the western slope. So that it does get difficult to hone in on these topics at a state level. So.
Great, thank you. And like we said, we do weight the data back to the state as a whole, so the Front Range does dominate this data set if you look at it. But that's why it's great that you all have your own reports. So, and we'll talk more at the end of this about how you can go home and do this yourself, but look at your data and compare yourself to the state so you can see what things are working well and what things are working worse. So sometimes you can say, actually, cost of living and housing is great where we live. And so usually when we do a workshop, we kind of make the folks like sticky dot vote or vote which areas we're going to work on and brainstorm. But because we took longer today to discuss the issues, there were some really rich conversations groups were having, not just about the state data, but their own communities and what was happening, so we allowed that to happen. So we're not going to need to decide which are the top issues unless someone here at the state wants us to vote and pick them. But it seemed like they're very common themes, like everyone's saying, around the housing, around the access to care, healthcare, mental health, social isolation, and the communication. Yes, Jill?
The challenge is that we don't control housing or mental health or, that's not, we don't have a lot of control over that. So that means if we're going to work on it, we need to be part of a consortium, we need to bring leaders, we need to bring other people together to work on this, because this isn't really our area of expertise, so that's another challenge. I have been trying to figure out the ones that we deal with pretty much solely in our world, whether it's between the area agency and on aging, our contractors and our county councils on aging to deal with some of those issues that we have more control of, but those big ones are huge and impact everything else.
And that's why actually when we started doing the survey, when we started doing surveys in communities, we would call them kind of community reports or cards. And with CASOA, we specifically stayed away from that because we know you all have too little to do too much. And we also know that you aren't the primary player. Like when I work in local governments and streets don't look good, they can change the streets. I mean, to some extent, they have budget concerns, but you can fix the potholes. For you all, so much of it's outside your control. So I think a lot of the stuff that was said by Wade and Sandy earlier about the being leveraging and partnerships and collaborations is more how we're going to have to think more creatively, because none of these issues, I think, straight up there are, well, communication, maybe, is about the only one that you have more control over than any of the other issues. But that doesn't mean, which I tell the local governments who tell me that they don't have control over it, I'm like, doesn't mean you don't have to fix it.
That's
sorry.
right.
Because you're held accountable for it nonetheless. And your community is livable or not, whether the AAA has control of it or not, they can work to do better. So we're going to move on and talk a little bit about how people address the issues they identify in their community that need changing. And so I think it was a number of years ago, one of the folks I had given survey data to was like, well, what do other people do with the data? And so I started thinking about all the different things folks had done with their data over the years. And we kind of developed a model of the types of strategies, or the ways you can use data. And we call it the 6 E's. But we're going to start out with the first D, and that is envision, and that's plan. And that's what we're doing today. One of the best things you can do is what you're doing right at this moment, is actually sitting together as a group and debriefing this data. A lot of people have intentions to move forward or make plans, but we think it's really, really important to use the data. Now, you all have to do the 4-year plan, so, or at least the AAAs here do. So it is going to be immediately useful for that. But also, as Jayla just brought up, what we talked about, planning at a different level, planning with community members, planning with other types of folks is really useful. So the first step is to look at the data, have folks debrief it, and try to figure out how to make sense of it. The exercises we went through this morning work out very well in community settings where you invite care providers, you invite residents. I've seen people invite the media. We all get together and talk about the results, private sector, and have them be part of the identification of the areas we need to move in and how to solve them, because then you have folks who are your non-typical partners coming to the table with resources. Second one. Earmarking. In your 4-year plans, if you can use these data, which we've made them very digestible, so it should be able to be used in your 4-year plans, at least to some extent, the ones that are allowed. You need to alter your budgets. People see survey data, they see resident needs, and they make choices. That's actually probably the easiest thing to do, is shift resources. And so one of the reasons why we kind of do these 60s is to let you think about other ways you can use the data. Educate. The big issue that came up today was we know the residents don't think they're getting enough information. We recognize that it's hard to communicate this information, but we only got about 50% saying they're great, there are good services for older adults in the communities. But one of the questions when I asked you up front, you said your community does have a lot of resources. And I think there are a lot of resources, just people don't know about them. So education is really important. And except traditionally governments and nonprofits have not put a lot of their budgets towards marketing, communication, advocacy. That's not what they did. They think any dollar spent there is a dollar taken away from serving someone, you know? And so it's a very complex issue, but I think it's something that governments and nonprofits are starting to realize you have to get in the game. You have to devote marketing money, and I think Sandy said she might talk more about it later, which would be great. But you need to start advocating for yourself, marketing and spending your budgets to educate folks, because that in the long run is going to maybe do much more than you do delivering one more meal to a homebound elder. Excellent. Engage. This luckily has been talked about very much again by way to Sandy, but I hear a lot more people talking about this now than when we first used to do these needs assessments, but our need to leverage resources, our need to develop partnerships. We can't do it all. We weren't able to do it all 40 years ago, and with the baby boomers aging, there's no way we can do it all. Also, like we said, a lot of these issues are outside of our control. So even if we did have enough resources to try to staff everything, we still need to make sure the private sector is working with us. We still need to make sure other forms of government are working with us. But also, we need to make sure we partner with our own residents. The older adults, as CASOA's whole foundation is, they are resources for our community. And the more we learn to utilize these folks and treat them as participants instead of service recipients, I think that's going to help us too. So figuring out ways to engage not only with other local governments and state and federal partners, private sector partners, nonprofits, but try to figure out how to utilize the older adults in your community now. We have a bunch of older people who are now retiring, and they may choose to have an encore career, but they may choose to do really meaningful volunteer work. We know the baby boomers are much more interested in meaningful volunteer work. Find ways to utilize those folks. Next one is an act. The reason why I like to stay close to government is that you actually have the ability to change communities through policies. I've seen communities change design guidelines, so universal design. I've seen people change some rules on how volunteers are insured so they can give seniors rides. But you actually have the ability, some of you either are in government or work very closely with local government folks, so that you can actually change communities in one foul stroke of your hand versus other people who are just dying for that kind of power. So working more with your elected officials to get them to change policies. I know, it's just like that, magic. But you do have the ability, more so than lots of folks, to change the situation of your community in a much more systematic way. And finally, my favorite, evaluate. But also, anything that you try and do, it's really important to make sure that you are doing it right. And so by doing CASOA, you've done it now a second time. Hopefully some of you will do it at more frequent time periods. or in any of the programs you're planning that you evaluate, make sure that what you're doing makes a difference. You may have great intentions of how you might be helping folks, but it may not work the way you intended. It may have negative side effects. It may not be, no one knows about it, so it would cost a lot of money, but it wasn't useful. So it's really important that you go back and spend some of your budget also making sure you know how well it's working. And here is an example of, so here's my example. It's about promoting older adult healthy eating. And these people decided to do it through community shared agriculture. So if you look at the 60s in this scenario, maybe what you decide is you're going to develop a 3-year food security plan. First, you're going to analyze the situation and figure out a plan. You're going to convene a community task force, not just the folks who care about older adults who need food, but also look at the faith-based organizations, look at the private sector, look at other folks who might care about community food security in your area. Earmark. Maybe you could write some small grants, or maybe you'll give out money as part of your 4-year plan. Maybe you will provide seed money, not only to the small farmers or any folks that are kind of really interested in getting into this business. In terms of education, maybe you help launch the education campaign. Maybe you just give a lot more information to older seniors and groups that will help them learn that this policy or program is in effect. And then finally, it might be that you want to provide some technical and training assistance to the farmers. They may not know how to do their accounting. They may not know exactly how to run the distribution routes, but maybe giving some types of funds to folks who are going to serve the older adults. Engage, an example would be to work with your high school, to create high school kids who maybe will develop either grow the garden or actually maybe deliver the produce. Maybe you develop an encore university. If you have older adults in your community that want to give some kinds of hints to either the farmers or the kids growing the farms, have those folks come in and help do those things. Enact, develop policies to encourage farmers to participate, maybe give them some kind of your local government tax incentives or work with them to do something like that, or give them some land to help farm. And then finally, you'd want to evaluate. So you might survey the older residents and find out if their household food security changed. You'd survey the farmers to see if their income has increased. And then also you would probably track like the food delivered. And again, in this model, you're not only involving the older adults, you're helping farmers, you're helping people who care about farmers, you're helping the environmental community and people who care about sustainable communities and the environment. And so you could get a lot of people engaged in a program like this that's serving the food needs of older adults, but you find a lot of other people with other interests. So we want to challenge you when you look at the CASOA data and write your plans, or even the broader plans that may not have as many stipulations of how you spend money, think about really creative ways to move forward with your strategies, because we're at a time, we talk about critical changing needs of our older adults, our services, and I think the more you can brainstorm and be creative and collaborative, I think you're going to identify some better solutions than we did in the past, where you're just saying, oh, we'll just add another driver to the Meals for Wills. That's not probably the future of what we're going to need to work for to make our communities more livable. So here are some recommendations. These are in the report, and you also will have them in your own. But NRC also gives recommendations. I'm not going to go over them today, but basically just talking about in each of the different sections of the report, we've done literature searches and identified the best practices and things people have done. So if your community ends up with a community information issue or community and belonging, you can look at our stuff, and sometimes we give you references where you can look further for best practices. As I talked about earlier, it is our goal to identify folks who do CASOA that are doing really good jobs and ask them if we could do case studies with them or have them talk and tell other folks what is it that they're doing, how they're getting such a high score in some areas, because I think by benchmarking information, it's a good way to kind of compare apple to apple and find out really those top performers. And we'll just go through all of it. Again, I won't mention them, but I just know that they're in the reports. What time are we at right now?
1:38.
Okay. Well, so I have about 10 more minutes of presentation, but what I intended was about to take 10-15 minutes and strategize, or brainstorm about the strategies. What do you guys want to do? Or would you rather talk with your tables? Do you want to do questions and answers? We have about 10 minutes free. Yes?
I just have a quick question. On the recommendations that are in our reports, tell me again how you came to those recommendations. Were they Are they coming from the?
They're mostly from the literature, and when I say the literature, it used to be the literature, it's also now the internet. So I updated them, I think, a year and a half ago or something, we updated them. And then I also just do searches like best practices, and so some of them are based on reports folks have put out, some of them, so it's literature, internet searches. If there's been policy briefings or guides where they highlight people, we've chosen those as examples. But I'm not promising it's completely inclusive. I mean, this literature changes dramatically every year, and so it's just a place to start in terms of recommendations. So, or folks want to brainstorm, or we just want to move on a little bit and talk more about how to use these plans in your community? Move on. Okay, let's move on. So, what we tried to model today, and so what we would normally do if we had a longer time together, I often do a workshop where we start out, we look at our data, then we identify 2 to 3 focus areas. We have the sticky dot mode. And then what I do is have the tables break up and work on an issue. So if we had more time, I would say, you guys do housing, you guys do access to healthcare, you do community. And people in each table brainstorm, and they develop a plan, or just ideas that they actually think are really important. And then, again, get back to the group. And then if we have a longer workshop, the folks actually develop an action plan based on it. Now, you have 4-year plans, a lot of you, so you can use that. Other folks who don't have a motivation to plan will do smaller action plans. But I want to just put in a plug for the fact of how effective this is in looking at data and trying to make changes. Because the minute you make a plan and you assign a person to work on it and you put a timeline, it will make it happen. But the other thing I want to talk about why it's beautiful is the sharing of ideas, especially when it's a brainstorming mode, comes up with really creative ideas that can cross silos of government, cross silos of topic areas, and it kind of breaks down a lot of barriers. And so in the model, when we talk about doing this with groups, the first step is that I encourage every single one of you is what we did here at this level or some version of it, you should go back home and do it. Go back in your AAA, and if you haven't done it already, get some people together. A good model would be to at least have a bunch of people on your staff or key stakeholders do it. But the ideal for CASOA is really to move up the community chain and to really involve other groups. So if you can take these CASOA data at a workshop, present them, and have folks from all different sectors, invite them and make sure they're there, mix them at tables, and have them help brainstorm the problems and also what they can do for solutions, you're going to have them be much more active participants in the community. We found that if the media now is involved in this, when I've done it with the media, they actually now are more interested in covering some stories in a more positive light on maybe the issues you're facing. Or maybe you get some folks from key businesses in your community to sit at the table. They might be very creative in terms of workforce development, encore universities, caregiver policies that they weren't aware of. The minute you make them become a participant in the solution, they are wearing a different hat. And then you're not going to them just asking them for money. They're actually now helping you create the funds. So it's our ideal that you would go through this model and maybe not, if this is your first time doing the CASOA and just working with the data, do the mini debriefing. But if you're ready for it, we would encourage you to move it up the ladder and get more folks involved in using the data and helping you plan your community or helping you as part of the public input for the 4-year plan, but in ways just to see that it can be very beneficial. And like I said, the CASOA, like you said, you should have your own plan. There's the statewide plan, and the national data, and there's the benchmarks. So when you're looking at your own data, it's really important to keep those benchmarks in comparison. And also, I guess it sounds like you're going to share other reports. So if you know there's another AAA that's like you might want to look at their plan as well and see and talk to them about what are you doing. We both have a real big need in safety, and a lot of the other communities in Colorado don't. So maybe we need to think of something more unique for our areas. But we'd encourage you to use these data for decision making because once again, they're really based on a representative sample of residents, not just the older adults who you hear from all the time. Or one of the first times I did one of these workshops, they actually had staffed it with all the folks who were already getting money from the AAA. And so when we asked them what the biggest issues were, every single person voted for the service they were providing, of course. You know, right? And so, which only makes common sense. But then they didn't want to hear about issues that they weren't already currently in. So it's really important that the CASOA data be used along with other types of data of what you're currently doing because it really does reflect the baby boomers, the prevention side, and all the other kinds of issues that aren't as tangible in the older adult literature these days. Like I said, we know the big trade-off. If you involve a lot more people in the pot, collaboration is a time suck. It's a lot more work to hold these meetings or go around. It sounds like Jayla went down and gave presentations to how many people, I don't know. But often my experience with collaboration has been, even though at the time it seemed like I didn't have enough time and it was painful, you almost always end up with a better product. So think about the resources you have and figure out what's the right trade-off for you to do in terms of your plan. And so in ending, I want to say keep on rowing. It sounds like I said, Colorado is a very progressive state in terms of doing CASOA. There's only one other state that does it statewide, that's Indiana, and you guys are the first to do it. And so I'd love for you to be a model for how the AAAs can all work together along with other legislators to move forward with the data. And so just keep moving and changing, because I know you all have really complicated jobs. And then we have a few more minutes for questions and answers. And also, we have Angelica here if you want some things on communication. Or questions people have for each other. Yes?
Hi guys, it's Mindy with the state. So, sorry to put Courtney on the spot a little bit. With respect to, we keep calling it marketing, but you know, it's that wraps all into communication, outreach, promotion, targeting, you know, that whole component of it. We just have to be a little careful about calling it marketing, is my understanding, because it's not, you know, you don't want to be competing with other organizations and things like that, but it truly is more about promotion, getting the word out.
Public education?
Yeah. And I don't know if you guys are sensitive to that or not.
Well, I think that, you know,
Oh, yeah, sure.
I think with marketing, I think you can look at getting the information out about your services. So what comes to my mind is in your NAPIS report or whatever, what do you call it here? The SAMS report, or it's changing now? Whatever, okay. So outreach. Outreach can be done in a lot of different ways, being to a group, there's definitions that can be done. So I mean, it can be used as a service, but also you don't want to use all your B dollars to just target or market the services or do outreach on the services. So, that's something you have to be able to look at that. I think I've said this before. I know I've said it to Todd and Mindy, and I said it to Wade this morning too. So my pitch as a citizen of Colorado, not your regional office staff, is so I know that with the amount of federal dollars that you get, it's less than the state dollars you get. However, there are not administrative dollars tied to the state dollars, so it's the federal dollars that has to do all of the admin, particularly at the state level, because the state dollars have to go directly to services, so there's not state admin dollars to implement the programs. So I think that if moving forward, Wade, commissioners, being able to talk with the legislators about the need for more administrative dollars being able to be tied to the Older Coloradans Fund, you could actually have a statewide campaign to be able to market, to target, to really be able to do that outreach on a statewide basis and be able to have more dollars to be able to look at this problem of communication, because in the many years that I've been here, not as many as Dave, but we're still the best kept secret. And I mean, looking at the data, what percent, it went down from the last CASOA, we're even a bigger secret at this point, which is so sad. But there's so many great things going on too, but I think that really being able to get some admin dollars for the state dollars would be a key to be able to really be able to fully implement the programs the way that they should be done. Maybe not fully, but in a better way, that there could be a statewide strategy on being able to get the word out about the services. Did I answer your question? Kinda.
Yeah, and just back to the term marketing, is there a sensitivity or are there specific limitations on you can't do
here or this. No, you can't lobby with Older Americans Act dollars, but you could market calling it outreach. But I think all of that could fit under the outreach category.
Well, and in fact, we have grants from ACL where we are responsible for marketing. I mean, it says in a deliverable that you will market this service. So,
yeah.
So, there's a difference in some people's eyes between advertising and marketing. Meaning, you can't buy pens and notepads and squishy balls for stress relief and things like that. That's advertising, where marketing would be more of the brochure, educational wrap card, that sort of thing. I think that's more of the definition and the permission that I would be asking for. I don't know about anybody else.
We buy swag all the time.
We buy swag.
We do too. We do too.
So with some dollars, if you get SHIP or S&P dollars, don't buy swag with it.
Okay.
Yeah, you can't do that with that, but.
You can't do that with the SHIP and S&P dollars because that just isn't, prohibited. It's in the grant to the state that you can't do that, but with
But
Older
there's a lot,
Americans
yeah,
Act
there's a
stuff,
lot of
so.
things you can't. Nobody's gonna come to your fair booth if you don't have something cool, let me tell you. It's a competitive market out there.
Oh my God. Thank you.
What's our time? Chocolate. 1:51.
chocolate.
Well, I guess while we're talking about marketing, does anybody else, because obviously Jayla has some experience, is there anyone here that actually has some other innovative ideas they've used for public outreach, education, marketing that fits within guidelines that they can share? I mean, do we have a best practice going on yet? What?
What about sponsoring events and co-sponsoring and others?
Have folks done that?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, we have something that we're starting, and we're just kind of, we're in the beginning phases. So
we have the partnership for Age-Friendly Communities going on in Larimer County, and part of that, we have the CSU Extension Office, which is part of the partnership. And the CSU Extension Office, their job is to educate and outreach. And so they put together a self-directed volunteer team because they recognize that people don't know where to go for services. So they went out and did a small survey, and they'd go to groups, and people said, well, if you need information, where do you go? Well, I would go to the Office on Aging. So they knew that we were already out there, but we weren't really out there. So they're in the process of developing this project called Senior Access Points. And we're partnered with them, and we're just, and one of the things about extension services is that is their job. And this is the first time that CSU Extension has recognized aging as an issue in the community, that we need to be paying attention to aging as a university. And so that's kind of what we're partnering with the CSU Extension. So we're still ironing out some differences, but that's kind of the direction we're going. And one of the things the partnership was to look at, the CSU Extension has offices all over the state. And so, is there a way to leverage that and move it around the state and have the extension offices help us with some of this outreach?
Yeah, we used to go to them and ask them what fungus is on our leaves, but now we can ask them where we can go to get our older parents services. But again, really creative ideas can come from partnering with the right folks. So if I leave you with anything is think outside the box, use the data, because the data is a great justification. It's a great calling card for the community for people to look at the data and understand the data. And it's also just a great calling card for you to find those atypical partners or new partners that you're going to have to blend with in the future to serve older adults. And so thank you once again. And if you have any more questions about CASOA, you can email our office or talk to us once you look at your data more closely and are trying to figure out what it all means, because I know it's a ton of data. So it's useful for everybody, but at the same time, you might have questions.
So Michelle, you'll send the slides to Erin?
We will.
We already have.
Oh, you've already uploaded them?
They're on the desktop.
So she has them, so.
Okay, okay. So
Then if you have any follow-up questions, feel free, and we will get back to you.
and we can put them on our C4A website?
You can do whatever you like with those.
Great.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
And good luck with your
So Sandy is gonna kind of continue, Sandy's gonna go ahead and continue with this conversation, so here you go.
Oh, thank you, thank you.
Cindy, do you want to drive? Or do you like driving?
Well, if you want to drive, we'll try
that's-
that.
yeah,
You know,
that's helpful.
I gotta drive back to Denver tonight, so I'm gonna let you. Yeah. If you could pull it up. Yep. Michelle, amazing work, and thank you so much. And I've got your number because you are so lucky to have the data source that you have. So I'm going to call you.
Sorry I have to leave.
No.
But I have folks here that are going to give me the information.
Great, thank you. Well, so I wanted to take a little bit of time just to kind of focus in on this morning's discussion, Michelle's great discussion about what you wanted to prioritize, and how you can wrap this into area plans. And here I'm going to challenge a little bit because I haven't talked to Todd, so I don't know exactly, the directives that you're having from the state. But the one thing that Linda didn't really tell you this morning, because I don't think I gave her that information, is I am a planner. My graduate degree is in urban planning, and I focused in on community planning. So all this discussion about plans just makes my heart sing. I get really excited about it. So I really want to talk about planning and the role of in community planning, because what you're doing is more than a document. It's more than a piece of paper, and again, I know you don't want to put a lot of work into something that's going to go up on the shelf that you're not going to use. So if we go to the next slide, I really wanted to talk to you a little bit about the value of this. And with this data, with what you want to do, with the new directions that you want to go in, it's really critical for you to engage your staff, as Michelle was saying. Make sure that they have a sense of the data, your advisory boards and your commissions. But then you got to go outside of that. You got to talk to your providers. You got to talk to the other key stakeholders in the community. Because as we've talked this morning, you all will never have enough resources to solve all these problems alone. In the children's world, it takes a village to raise a child. It takes a village. It's going to take every stakeholder in your community working with you to be able to ensure that you can meet the needs of older adults. But that's a very cool opportunity. And as Linda was talking about, extension coming to the table. It's funny, years ago when I was at the National Association of Counties, I worked with the Extension Office in DC, and they had a whole department on aging. And there are those types of kind of like hidden treasures all over the place. You need to surface those. And you need not to be fearful of engaging the private sector. The private sector can be your friend, whether it be the healthcare community, your local grocery, food chains. You will be surprised at who will come and want to be engaged, and ultimately may be a leverage source for resources, if not direct dollars, in-kind resources. And I know we're talking about communications, which we don't have a big budget for, but it is amazing how many area agencies on aging have been able to get pro bono assistance from private communication firms to be able to help them move forward. So the value of community planning is to be able to get that input and make sure you have multiple generations involved. Because as we talked about this morning, when you're looking at planning for the future, it's not just one generation, it's not just two generations, you're looking over the lifespan. So you need to make sure that you engage people and that they too own into the data that Michelle has, so they really realize and recognize from a lifespan perspective the importance of aging. And when doing that, I think we can also not only change the perspective of aging, but also start to diminish some of those negative stigma of ageism that we have as well. So the value of community planning, I think, is huge from an engagement perspective. But I think also, if we look at going to the next slide, is the basis of community planning. And you've already started to outline that. But from my perspective, from all of my years in doing planning at the community level, is
It's assessing those individual needs, and you've got that through your data. And you may be able to augment that. And there's some areas when you really focus in on, you may want to do a deeper dive, because even, some of the questions that you've had this morning is, well, if this is a need, well, is it more of a need in rural areas? Is it more of a need in urban, suburban? What about the age group? What about the income level? So you really need to get a sense of digging deeper to find out those individual needs, and also recognizing, point in time, these needs will change over time. But then you need to then step that back and then look at the context of your entire community, because you're going to have to integrate that into your transportation system, who may or may not understand the importance of this. Your housing, we just talked about the fact that a lot of the issues that you surfaced as major priorities are areas outside your control. The only way you are going to get those stakeholders involved is if they feel like they have a stake, they have ownership in this. And an example that I would use there is in age-friendly planning in New York, and also there's examples in Virginia, where the county commissioners took this on as a challenge, to be able to look at creating livable communities, not necessarily picking up the whole age-friendly WHO model, but how can they make sure that their aging counties primarily were really reflective of the needs of their changing population. So to do that, the county executive called all of his cabinet level folks together and said, I want you, each of you are to go through your policies of your department and tell me how you're going to be able to respond to the needs of an aging population. Well, you can imagine that the Department of Taxation kind of moaned a little bit about that. Or, I can go through a variety of different, departments and said, look, this is a human services issue. This is a social services issue. This does not affect us. Basically, the county exec says, I don't care. I don't care. This is what you're to do. I want you to come back, I want you to reflect, and then I want you to come back into me and tell me how you're going to work with the Department of Aging and ensure that the needs of older adults now and in the future. And they, I think in most of these cases, put the benchmark at 50 plus. And in doing that, what they ended up doing is not only changing policy and incorporating programs, changing programs, because there is no more money given, but they also created new champions in departments across the whole community that weren't there before. So when you're looking at community planning, it's looking at the individuals, but it's also looking at, your local government, looking at your community at large and what you need to impact. So if we look at go to the next slide, thanks. It's really looking at, this isn't easy, that we really need to plan what the future is going to be. We need to plan it for people, and we need to plan it across the lifespan. So next slide. You need to use this data. You have a treasure trove of data, and you need to translate it for the people in your communities, but you also need to translate it for individuals and those family caregivers, because you're looking at it a little differently than they are. The other thing that I would say is you use terms that aren't necessarily friendly to older adults themselves or caregivers or other stakeholders. The terms of home and community-based services or adult protective services, you know what they mean, but other people don't. So as you have these community discussions, you all know just to make sure that you translate it. But use the data that is the strongest. The fact that people want to age at home and in the community is the basis and foundation of what we do. It's also the basis and foundation of how we plan moving forward. And you have, again, a treasure trove of data. Go through that, cull that out, bucket it into what will resonate most with different targeted population groups, and use it strategically. Have a slide deck that pulls out all those data. So when you go out and make community meetings, pull the slide deck and put together what would be most reinforcing to that group. Next slide, please. And ground it into your own community perspectives. You have a unique culture here an amazing, you can sense when you come to Colorado that there is, you all are different. And I say that in a very positive sense. No, I mean, you are very special, Jill. But don't lose that. Make sure that you're speaking to the special nature of the populations that you have, and you always want to reflect that unique culture and spirit that is here. Because you don't want the data to dissuade that. You don't want to dilute that in any way, because that's what people are proud of. For those people who grew up here, that's part of who you are, your DNA and your spirit. For people who have moved here from other communities, they moved here because they want, capitalize on that. And that energy and spirit, and also commitment to being able to make their community a better place for all, for themselves, but also for others. Because oftentimes with plans, we water that down a little bit, and to me, by doing that, you dilute the commitment that you ultimately are going to need to implement the plan. So in looking at the next slide, you really want to create a pathway and a vision for the future. And there are lots of different futurists and visionaries out there. At C4A's conference last summer, we were really privileged to have Joe Coughlin from the MIT Age Lab, who wrote a book on the longevity economy. But what he did was look at the changing face of aging, but also how that impacts us from a community perspective. I also want to reinforce the term economy in there, because as you're looking at your plan, we want to focus in on assets and needs, but also the fact that the aging population is a major driver in your communities. And oftentimes, as Michelle had pointed out in her slide this morning, that gets overlooked. That gets completely overlooked. And people look at the aging of the population as a drain rather than a driver. And so please, if you haven't, you can even, if you want excerpts from that book, just let me know. But I think it's really a matter of changing our mindset about how we talk about aging, both from the needs perspective, the assets perspective, but what it really means at the community level. Because let's face it, in most of your communities, if all of the older adults left and went someplace else, would not be a good thing, right? And then you also need to take into consideration the impact and the fact that when we're talking about an aging population, you're not just talking about older adults themselves, no matter where you put that marker, but you're also talking about their caregivers. So going on to the next slide, when you look at your area plan, I really challenge you to look at it as more of a compliance document, and in saying that, I haven't had a chance to go through all of yours, but I know as I go across the country and I talk to other area agencies on aging, sometimes, they go, that it's not really worth doing. I mean, they do it, they go through it, and they feel like it's more of a check the box document than it is really a plan that really forges what they want to do moving forward. And it's not necessarily a public facing type of document that really talks about the vision for the future. Compliance is important, and I will be the last person to say, I talked this morning about the importance of quality standards and all of that. But when you're talking about planning needs to be more than that. It needs to be bold, it needs to be a vision, but you've got to back that up with implementation. And so you need to figure out, you can't come up with ideas that are out of compliance, certainly, but you need to have it be a bolder document than that. And with all of the discussions you've had about the data and your priority setting, I'm sure you will. So in looking at going to the next one, is the other part of that, kind of going along with not just being a compliance document, is being a public statement of your commitment to aging. A public statement of why you exist and what your vision is, and being able to help support and value people as they age in your community. And in looking at that, what are the elements? You need to look at what people's needs are, but you also need to look at the assets and the diversity, and you need to look at your unique culture, and you need to look at your goal. And your goal, as we talked, is really to ensure that people can age well. So make sure that as you look at this, that you go through and you really figure out, what are my priorities? What are the state priorities? How do they translate into the local level? So when you put the state plan and the area plan together, what you have got is that vision for the future. What you have got is something that you could take to any stakeholder and say, this is what I want aging to be like in Colorado. This is what I want it to be in my community, and this is how we're going to make it happen. So if you go to the next slide, it's really looking at a roadmap. And this is interesting. I was able to participate in a something that West Health did, looking at, and that's a healthcare company, but they had this incredibly group of stakeholders together talking about what was the roadmap for successful aging. They were primarily focused in on nutrition, but it was interesting as people kind of threw out, well, this is where I see we should go, and this is where, and then pulling that all together into something that made sense. Something that you could go from point A to point B, and when you got to the end, you were at successful aging. So again, as you organize your thoughts, which is what planning is, you prioritize, you organize, it is making sure that at the end of this, that you don't lose sight of the people, and you've got a process that supports the direction that you want to go. And at the end here, it talks about the return on investment. Return on investment, not just from dollar and cent side, but also from human side. So if you go to the next slide, so what can the area plan be? We have several examples. I know that Courtney has examples and ACL has examples. That keeps talking, right? It's looking at the fact that some people are developing 4-year plans, but then in this instance, in King County, Washington, they did an update because they decided they wanted to do something different. They had a different opportunity. So instead of just having the plan on the shelf, they went back and said, no, I'm going to pull that plan down and I'm going to update it to reflect where we really want to go, what we're really going to do. So I encourage you to make this a living plan, make it a dynamic plan, make it your plan for the future. So in looking at, in using it to galvanize the public and your stakeholders through all of the engagement, but again, having this be your opportunity, how many of you, there are young faces in this room that kept saying, remember Courtney, by 2020, 1 in 5, and we kept saying, oh, that seems so far off. Well, it is not far off for those of us who have been around. We also thought by 2020 we would be golden, that all the resources would flow. Well, the only way that that's going to happen is if we up our game on how we talk about aging, how we plan about aging, and how we become, counter that argument about the best, the most, I tried to banish it from my thought, the best kept secret. We don't want to be the best kept secret. So if you go on, and the other part I'd like for you to be is excited about this, I'm a planner. I get excited about this. But when you're looking at this, happiness is in being excited about the future. Because if you're not excited about it, it's probably not going to turn out real well for you. So think about that, seriously. So get excited about what your planning can be and make sure it reflects your goals, your mission, but jazz it up a little bit. Go to the next one. Because bottom line is planning is bringing the future into the present so that you can do something about it now. And that's what you want to do. Through your area plans, using the data to really forge the future of what your communities are going to be like for older adults. And if you fail to plan, if failing to plan is planning to fail. So you have this opportunity here through your area plans, you have this opportunity with this incredible data to really be able to drive the future of aging here in Colorado. And from C4A's perspective, we're just really happy to help you in any way possible. And in saying, as you drive the future of aging here, I just want to end because I promised I would talk a little bit about marketing. I think one of the challenges that we face in aging is because of the resource base that we have is sometimes we sell ourselves short. And if we look at where we want to be, we can't do that anymore. We have to be aspirational, and we have to set goals and plans that will ultimately create us to reach, but ultimately recognizing we can't do it all ourselves. In saying that from a marketing standpoint, I don't think marketing is a bad word. Just like I don't think setting up a business case or a business development is a bad word. I think it's really the way that we need to go in the future. But I would challenge, and I challenge my members, and I know sometimes it may not be as well received, but I'm going to throw it out there anyway. When we look at marketing, I think that we need to first start out with what is our message. And it needs to be an elevator speech. It needs to be key and really concise. So, Linda, if you had the opportunity to go up in the elevator with Bill Gates and he had $1 million, how would you describe yourself in that few minutes you have from going from floor 1 to floor 10 to really get him jazzed up about why he should support aging?
Emergency.
Yeah. Oh, the elevator stopped. Oh.
You're not going anywhere.
But I think that's how we need to think. If we have a few minutes to really be able to sell ourselves, how would we do it? And making sure that we don't use our own jargon, but we talk about the value of what we do in changing people's lives. So I think messaging is key, and consistent messaging across the network throughout the state is even better messaging. Because I think the other thing sometimes is we forget we are a network. And we are stronger as a network, even though there are differences. No matter where you are in Colorado, the same thing is true in other states. So, you may have some tailored messaging that reflects your own community, but also have some messaging that reflects the state. The other thing is in your messaging is incorporating your providers. Oftentimes, one of the issues becomes is, people that you may contract with, you give them a contract to deliver services, or you use volunteers to deliver services, and the client base that you have never knows that those services come from you. It's from the church, or it's from this organization. We really need to change that. I'm not saying you need to usurp their identity, but you need to co-brand your identity. And this is really, really, really important, because otherwise you get lost, and nobody recognizes the fact that this meal was provided through the Older Americans Act, which is also a lobbying issue, or from the state. They just think somebody nice delivered it. So how can you look at your practices, your publications, your service delivery, and make sure that you don't get lost in there, that you take ownership for what you do, because you deserve it. And that will also ultimately position you to leverage more funds. Which is the other thing, is leveraging your partners. You're never going to be able to do this all yourselves, but there are other people out there that, if you engage them, will help you. I know through the work that we've done with dementia-friendly communities that in New York there was a community that we went into, and it was determined that food insecurity was an issue. The local chain of grocery stores dedicated days where they would donate a percentage of their sales to be able to support this effort. So, sometimes it's not asking them specifically for money, but what could they do from an in-kind perspective? And that puts them in a position of being good neighbors, being seen in the community as a real positive force. So whether, think about who in your community it would be good to involve and engage. And finally, leverage your own state network. Because, as you develop your plans, you have a state plan, you work to push your agenda forward, remember, you're always stronger together. So with that, that's all I'd be happy to answer any questions. I feel like when I'm being up here is being a cheerleader for this, but there are specific elements of planning that you can walk through. But in the late afternoon after lunch, I'm not going to do that to you. But I am here N4A is here. You've got an incredible resource, both with the state and with Michelle. But I think it's looking at how you can be aspirational and change that into what's implementable, and then how you sell it. Because ultimately, those are the three elements of going forth, doing good, and making a change. So thank you. And how am I doing on timing?
You're way ahead. So.
Okay.
There's questions.
Any questions?
Yeah. Comments, thoughts?
This is kind of peripheral.
That's okay.
I've talked a few times around, so in the partnerships, building partnerships, leveraging, and also leveraging our value, what we can provide and our expertise. We're starting to get inquiries from local tech companies and now actually some major retailers that are trying to enter the market in one way or another. And we're trying to figure out our role in that. I think we know that we have a role to play, and it's sort of there's sort of an advisory element to it, but there's
get paid for it.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. To ask for a contribution, I guess, or it would be for a fee.
I would fee, because
so,
you are. I think it's how do we get out of that mindset of you're paying for our expertise, so this is our fee structure.
So there's a consulting element to it, but then we're also seeing an opportunity to pilot, to potentially build products and services that may end up being sold in a private marketplace, or in the marketplace in general, which is an area that is really pretty foreign to us, and we don't necessarily have the infrastructure to just go ahead and move forward. We're kind of inching along, but I'd be curious how, what you're seeing, I guess, in the network, and around this, because there's also the potential for a lot of disruption, where tech companies or startup or app-based solutions could be vying for the same kind of space that our providers are in, or the space that we're funding services for. We may end up funding those types of providers down the road, like the Ubers and Lyfts and so forth. And so, as we kind of set out in our, strategic plans and whatnot, do you have any insights, or do you see maybe best cases across the country where AAAs are securing strong public-private partnerships, or strong maybe it's consulting arms, or it's in this space where, again, like Joe Coughlin I think his book is finally at the bedside table of a lot of CEOs in the country, and so we're starting to kind of pick up on that. Yeah.
What our suggestions have been so far, and some of this, and I'm reflective of some of the companies that have come to us and our strategy. So, is one, we start bucketing it. So one is consulting. You want us to just give you our best thinking on this? There's a fee. Two, do you want to run focus groups with older adults? Because oftentimes in Silicon Valley, the people that they're using for focus groups are not the same people that are using our services, right? So it's the reality check. So that is a separate fee. The third fee is pilots. We will, for a cost, we will run a pilot with a group of older adults you determine the time frame that's appropriate on the utilization of your product and get feedback for you. At this point, that's kind of how we've bucketed it, but we are very upfront on what the cost of each is based on the amount of time that staff would have to be involved. We make it really clear it's not an endorsement of their product. We try to be able to build the firewalls around for liability issues, but ultimately the goal is to whatever products go on the market to make sure that they really do meet the needs of older adults. We're not saying that we would use it or our providers would use it, but just helping them drive better product development. Does that help?
Yeah, very much.
Any other questions? In the back.
So for the area plans around the state, the different ways, from N4A perspective, there are many providers, I'm a provider with the Older Americans Act. There are many providers that are not part of this network of the Older Americans Act providing exactly the same services I am. And so how does that perspective outside of the Older Americans Act gain into their area plans, either at the national level or the state?
Let me answer your question
Sure.
two different ways. One, I'll try to answer your question, but I also wanted, it just kind of spurred another thought for me. So, the issue is with providers is, they should be, they're stakeholders and input should be included in the development of the plan. Whether they are necessarily, first you'd certainly go to the ones that you're funding, but also throwing your net more broadly, because the next funding cycle, it could be another group of providers, right? So I think that needs to be incorporated into the plan. Now, I'm saying that no one group should drive the plan. So, just putting that caveat out there as well. And who gets, it's kind of what Michelle putting out, about making sure that you don't have stakeholders around the table that just go, yeah, no, the priority should be what I'm getting funded for. I mean, you've got to be able to have enough of a mix and also walking in with that commitment that that's the direction that the discussion is going to go. So then the other point that I would raise is, the Older Americans Act requires an area plan, right? And so, and there are elements in there, but I've also seen a lot of area plans, area agencies develop area plans that had an Older Americans Act component, but it was broader than that. So it really became more of a agency vision for the future. So, that again is another discussion point for how you all want to move forward, right?
So to build on that, and I was just thinking about the same thing. In a previous life, I worked on education issues, and had a wonderful moment of clarity with around the achievement gap when a national expert on the issue was asserted that we talk about the achievement gap as an issue in our schools because that's where we measure it and that's where the kids are. But 70% of what contributes to the achievement gap happens outside of the schools and in the community and in the families. And when we expect the schools to solve it with just the resources they have, we're setting all of ourselves up for failure. And I do feel like there's a similar dynamic in aging. We've talked about this with the Medicaid folks, that they're responsible for the health of low-income older folks, and yet the product they get is at the end of this long stream of events that they may or may not be involved in. And if they can get upstream, they can start affecting some of those. We talked a little bit about Medicare, and the changes coming along there, but long-winded way of saying, of endorsing your last point, which is it's too easy. Look, planning is hard, and doing a document like we were talking about is hard, and people are stretched thin, so I want to be careful about what I'm saying, but this is a fantastic opportunity to share a vision with a broader community. And even if it's not in the purview of the Area Agency on Aging, if it's not in the authority of the AAA, if it's not in the budget of the AAA, we've talked about housing, we've talked about mental health, we've talked about things that go well beyond what you're funded to do or what you're asked to do or what you have authority to do. But it's an opportunity to share a vision that says if we really want to crack this nut, we're working on this stuff, but we all need to worry about all these other things as well. And I would urge folks to take that opportunity, and not just for a report on the shelf, but for how they communicate about it and how they engage all those partners as well. So I really wanted to endorse your concept of a larger plan for the community, not just for the agency, but for the community, and at least, I mean, you're not gonna do land use planning in this document, you're not gonna do transportation planning in this document. But you can share that vision, and you can set those goals.
Well, and the other part of that, building on that is, it doesn't all have to be, I mean, it can be incremental. I mean, doing just the area plan is a lot of work, I agree with Wade. But, so that's chapter 1, or that's section 1. And some of these other things may be smaller, they don't even have to be big. They could be, and they could be collaborative with other organizations, but they're something that you put on your on the horizon to make sure that you can get through all of them.
Or you can say, here's what we need from you,
Yeah.
the rest of the community.
Right.
We're doing our end, but you know what? We're really making this is the other purview. People can't get into affordable housing. People don't have access to housing choices, or this or that or the other thing, and just say, that is beyond what we do, but we can't succeed unless all the community comes in around. And so it's not a plan for how we're gonna do it, it's kind of a call to action.
Yeah, and I think the one thing that I would say too is, as you put this together and you move forward, however you decide to do it, is translate whatever is in your plan to the extent you can to a one-pager, where you just say, this is our goals and these are the elements, so that anybody, any stakeholder walking in and goes, oh, okay, I know what they do, I know what they want to do. One nice infographic, and you can get somebody to do that for you pro bono. You can, I know you can, either through a university or someplace, somebody else that can translate. And you really want to have somebody from the outside do that because you're too close to it. It would be really hard for you to take that and condense that down to a one-pager. So, look at this as your public facing, look at it as your roadmap, but also look at it from what you were saying is your partnership pathway moving forward as well. Question in the back?
All right, I was going to talk a little bit about this later, but I figured kind of on the topic of sort of an area plan that meets the requirement, right, of us at the state, and we need to have your area plan, and we have instructions for those, versus the public facing, like here's our vision, get the word out. And I know some of you are probably wrestling with that in your head as we're sitting here, and so I figured we might as well keep on this topic, right? Because we wrestled with it at the state. In fact, at lunch, Courtney and I were just talking about that. And I guess I want to say that, as AAAs, you do have an obligation to do the area plan. You do have to meet the requirements that we set forth in the state. But that doesn't mean it has to literally be in the exact same order in like this very, remote rote thing that's like pretty boring and all that. So I would encourage you all to think about how you can sort of meld both of those things. It gets a little tricky, I'm going to be honest, because the more you have to talk to us about your core services, right, and answer all the questions that are in there and all of those things, it gets long and it does get boring and and so it's a little bit of a balancing act.
Can I just ask a question of that? Because I know I'm being, I'm going rogue here. I know that. Because I'm a planner and I really think plans are important. But question on that. So in the body of the area plan, or even if it's, one section of a bigger plan, is it a way for you, can the AAAs frame, the more generalities and aspirational? And then for those answering your questions, which I know are specific in requirements, and I know they need to be done, can that be an appendices? Can you say, and see section, I'm just, and you may not know the answer, but I'm just throwing it out as a question, is because then it needs to be in there, and you need to have it. But does it need to be way down that first part of the plan? Because you're right. I mean, to answer some of those questions, people will read to page 13 and then they go, that's it. Except for you guys, because you'll read the whole thing. But, and God bless you. No, because it's important and you're required to do that, and I understand that. So I'm not. I know that a part of it is a compliance document. My push is, how can you blend the two? And maybe that's a discussion, with the state and the AAAs. How can you blend the two so that both purposes get out and you don't have to create two different documents?
Because ultimately, from the state perspective too, you really want this to be a more public-facing document talking about the value of aging in the direction as well. So how, and this is, I know, an ACL question, and I've raised
I got it.
I raised it with ACL.
She's done.
So, yeah, so I am here to just be provocative and then go. Yeah, I'm on an airplane and I'm treating a mess. And then people say, don't ever invite her back.
You guys are gonna tell me not to come back too, probably.
Yep. Okay. So for those of you who have seen the area plan instructions for Colorado for this year, we did try to focus on questions and issues that are relevant, right? Like all of these things that we've kind of been talking about, like it's not just, things that we like are boring and things like that. Like we're really trying to make sure that the questions that we are asking are things that you might want to already be including in your overall plan. The part that I want to let everyone know of is from our perspective, we just need to find that because there's 16 of you and one of us, and we need to take your 16 things and put it into one to give it over to ACL. And so if you have stuff all over the place in your plan and it's all random and we can't match your demographics with all the other demographics and really kind of draw some high level conclusions, then that just makes our job difficult and we can't develop a low quality state plan. So that's really the purpose of having specific things, and I think like Todd and I have talked about it, and our instructions are laid out like section 1, section 2, section 3, and if you even want to do like a guide for us that says, hey, the demographic stuff is on this page, right, or this section 2 stuff is on this page, as long as we can find what we need to find to collate it, then that's really more the intent of having specific things you have to include and having, being able to find them. So it doesn't have to look a certain way, it doesn't have to be in a very specific order, as long as we kind of collate that.
But in looking at that, because the goal of this is to blend the data with the actions that you're taking to address the data, the compliance core, matching them to the core services. But then the other part of that is for the document to tell a story. So in some ways, and I would say that in general, probably having them be consistent would be helpful. It's just a matter of the language and pulling them together. So maybe, you've got your guidance out there, and then I'm gonna really sit down and let Courtney talk, because I really messed things up. But I think the thing is I don't think the two are at odds. I just think it's a matter of style and format and how you pull it together. And I think it can be done. And it's wonderful that you guys are so open to the flexibility there, applaud and kudos to you. But I think the thing is that, basically you want it to be a document that works for you and works for everybody in the room. So, and I really am going to sit down because I'm really in trouble.
So Sandy is so not in trouble. She's a visionary. She's a visionary. I love it. So let me tell you a story. I will not disclose which state this was. However, I review state plans, and sometimes we sit and we think, holy moly, how are we going to get this approvable? And so I don't review there, so I don't know. I've had to go back and plead for other information, like, do you have a strategic plan? Can we add your strategic, like your departmental strategic plan to your state plan as an appendix? I don't want to have to do that. I've had to do that for another state to make it approvable, because all it said was blah, 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 transportation, meals, this. It wasn't visionary. It didn't address the needs assessment kind of stuff. Like, it barely address the requirements within our program instruction, and we're like, Percy and I are sitting there like, oh my goodness, and it was a stretch to get it approvable. So I follow whatever instructions, because I don't want to make Todd and Mindy's life more difficult, because then they'll just make it difficult for me. So that's not. But we.
It does roll uphill sometimes.
It does roll uphill sometimes, I promise. But we want, from AOA's perspective, we want this to be a visionary document. We want good performance measures in there. We want to be able to see the data. We don't want to just see that we do X, Y, Z, but where do you want that to be in the next 5 or 10 years? And I mean, that's what we want to see, because we don't want it to be a document on a shelf. We want to be able to track it and be able to measure it. And I have to tell you guys, I use Colorado as a model with a lot of my other states of the way that Mindy and staff are able to track the performance measures and the progress that they're making. It's not perfect, but it's a heck of a lot better than what's out there in a lot of other states where they're just saying, yeah, we kind of do meals and these are our service areas and, you know, we're not visionary at all. You know, so I want to see that you guys do such a great job with your strengths and needs assessment with CASOA, and you can really monopolize on that to really look at what's happening within your communities, and it can really help inform the direction that the state is going to go. And I mean, I've been around a long time, so 26 years, and this is really honestly the first time that I've been able to see with what's happened with SAPCA and with Wade coming on and everybody coming together for these conversations. Dave, wouldn't you agree that it really is, it's almost like a pinnacle in my career of being able to see that everybody is wanting to really work together for the moving the state forward with aging. And it just, I don't know, it just totally makes my heart so happy. So I don't know, there's my little soapbox. So, yeah.
So, I think Boulder and Dr. Cock, we do two different reports generally. One that's the compliance piece. The challenge is we write differently to you all, because we're answering those questions, and it's very, you know, we need to give you the information that you need. And then the public facing one is almost more slick. It's slick, it's a little bit sales, it's broader, it's visionary, this is where we need to go, these are the big topics, we need you to be a part of this too. And so I think I would struggle as I'm sitting here trying to think how to combine them, how I would do that. I think I'm probably still going to stay with 2 because I'm already halfway through writing it. And I don't want, yeah, it'll be like part 1, part 2. And then I think we're also going to update it mid-year, because the reason I started writing a more well, the first one is when I was in school, I had to read the Dr. Cog Area Plan on Aging, and oh my God, it was the most boring thing I'd ever read in my life. And when I became the director, I thought to myself, I'm going to make this at least something that somebody wants to read, or a little bit more enjoyable. But now people really use it in the regions in many different areas. At CDOT, they have a copy of my report at CDOT. How awesome is that? That's really cool. But that's that influencing piece, right? That helps push those other agendas. It brings in those other partnerships.
We're actually, for this round, our plan is to lead with the data. So we're actually coming up with a primary and secondary data report to get that buy-in to develop this strategy. This is the broader strategic plan, not the area plan necessarily. So we're also trying to build more stakeholders and also give credit to the folks who are doing the work.
Yeah.
But it's sort of like an economic development plan where you've got kind of these big, elements to it, and then you give credit to the folks who are investing, the folks who have the solutions.
I like that idea
and get them to buy into then driving those solutions together into the future. That's kind of our lofty goal for it. But so it's which is a third, I guess that would be a third document. But we're going to try to get more buy-in with the data.
But I can see those of you that are smaller and they're like, yeah, I don't have the resources to do that. I can't do that. And so that's the challenge, right? How do we help? And that, I think we have to talk about that tomorrow, a lot more about how we help the network of the area agencies on aging be all that we could be, just like the Army.
I just have a comment. In Well County, we're going to be doing something that I think is really interesting. It was a little bit breathtaking because I'm not quite sure where it's going to go, but United Way, who has over the last several years really shifted their vision from older adults to really families and youth. And I think that's been probably a nationwide movement, and probably United Ways in your area have had that same focus. Luckily in Weld, and it took some lobbying, they're actually moving to educating they are moving to what's called a collective impact process, and that's been happening across the country in several different arenas. And when they initially started talking about collective impact, first we didn't quite understand what that meant, but that's another whole discussion. But in their identification of key topical areas, aging was not part of it at all. And we really pushed and said, the time has come, you must listen and you must prepare as a community and how you're going to work with an aging population. And a United Way perspective is a much broader perspective than and visibility than right now, whether we like it or not, than the Agency on Aging. And so we were successful, and aging has become one of the 5 groups. And so now we are tasked with this great undertaking of a collective impact, which means those agencies that have traditionally been funded or identified may or may not get those dollars. And to be honest, we didn't get a lot of United Way dollars anyway, but nevertheless, now we're all having to come together, and like Sandy said, it's not just me raising my hand saying, you know, I'm the transit provider, I want all the money to come to me. It's forcing us in a collaborative kind of way to come up with a project. And most likely it's going to be a multiple year project, and we're going to be using the CASOA as our key data source as well as others. But so we're actually going to have our our second meeting, but the first one with actually using the CASOA and having that initial conversation. So I'm really excited based on what we learned today and how we use the CASOA. So I have a better concept in my mind how I'm going to present this information to this collective impact. And I think there's a way for me to take that information and also put it into my area plan as that we're working on these particular kind of projects above and beyond what our core is. So for what it's worth, you know, it's just sort of motivated me instead of just created angst in me of how we can accomplish this in a creative way.
So I think we might be ready for break. Your words of wisdom. We're just having to think about it.
Linda, do you want to give an announcement about dinner right now?
Sure. What is the announcement? So I want you to hold off because we do have something special before we go on break. So hold on.
When and where? Lunch?
Yeah, when and where.
Yeah. Oh.
So Erin is going to make an announcement about dinner because I don't know.
So we have reservations tonight at 6:30.